They came with the wind, longships slicing through seafoam like knives through silk. On distant shores, their arrival was a whisper, then a storm, monasteries burned, kings trembled, and empires reeled. To their enemies, they were demons in human form. To history, they were raiders, pirates, barbarians, but the truth, as always, is far deeper than the myth. The Vikings were not just the war cries echoing across the North Sea or the smoke rising from plundered villages, they were explorers who reached the edge of the known world. They were settlers, shipbuilders, craftsmen, poets, and lawmakers. They carved their world from ice and fire, from fjords and forests, from blood and belief, from the icy coasts of Scandinavia to the fertile rivers of Francia, from the wild frontiers of Ireland to the rocky shores of North America. The Viking story is one of ambition, courage, and transformation. In this deep dive, we set sail across the full arc of the Viking saga. We'll travel to the longhouses of Norway, the courts of Dublin, and the steppes of Rus. We'll uncover the daily lives of Norse farmers, the gods they worshipped, and the battles they fought. We'll explore their ships, their myths, their politics, their colonization of Iceland and Greenland, and their brief but historic landing in North America. And we'll witness how this fierce and far-reaching culture eventually transformed, not into silence, but into something greater and more lasting. So grab your shield, step aboard. The sea is calling. Subscribe now and join us on this epic voyage into the heart of Viking history. There's far more to these sons and daughters of the North than you've ever imagined. Chapter 1: The Birth of the Northmen. In the far northern reaches of Europe, where the land is hewn by ice and rock, and where the sun can vanish for weeks or blaze without rest, a unique people arose, resilient, formidable, and destined to change the course of history. These were the Northmen, the ancestors of what we now call the Vikings. Long before they carved their names into the annals of the medieval world, they lived scattered across the harsh landscapes of what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Life in early Scandinavia was unforgiving. The soil was thin and stony, yielding only the most modest of crops. Winters were brutal and long, while summers were brief and precious. Communities had to be small, tight-knit, and fiercely cooperative just to survive. These early Scandinavians developed a way of life that emphasized toughness, autonomy, and loyalty to clan and kin. They learned to adapt to their surroundings. Fishing the rich waters of the fjords, raising livestock in the valleys, and mastering the forests and mountains for wood, iron, and game. Their society was decentralized, governed not by kings in palaces but by chieftains who ruled over small bands of warriors and farmers. These leaders were not appointed by blood alone but earned their position through strength, generosity, and cunning. Reputation was everything in this world, and the sagas that later immortalized Viking exploits reveal a culture obsessed with honor, vengeance, and personal legacy. Though isolated geographically, Scandinavia was not cut off from the outside world. Trade routes brought amber, furs, and iron into contact with the civilizations of the Baltic, the Rhine, and even the distant Byzantine Empire. These early exchanges laid the foundations for what would become a far more aggressive outward expansion. Over time, pressures began to mount at home, competition for arable land, internal feuds, and the ambitions of young warriors seeking glory abroad. A restless spirit began to stir among the Northmen. This restlessness coincided with technological and social developments that would soon transform the Norse people from tribal farmers into a seaborne force of destiny. They developed new shipbuilding techniques, perfected the art of navigation by the stars and coastlines, and began forming larger, more coordinated bands capable of traversing the sea, not merely to fish or trade, but to raid, to settle, and to rule. The Norse were not yet Vikings, in the sense of raiders. The word Viking itself is debated in origin. Some trace it to the Old Norse word vik, meaning bay or inlet, suggesting someone who came from the fjords. Others connect it to Vikingr, meaning a sea rover or pirate. But the term would only later be applied to those who undertook maritime expeditions, usually for war or plunder. In this early phase, they were simply Northmen, farmers, craftsmen, traders, hunters, and seafarers, living at the edge of the known world, shaped by snow and sea, fire and myth. These people lived steeped in oral traditions. Before written runes were etched in stone or inscribed in wood, knowledge passed from father to son, mother to daughter, across long winters by the hearth. Tales of ancestors, gods, monsters, and heroes were recited to build identity and memory. In these stories lay the roots of a culture that valued bravery above life, loyalty above law, and honor above peace. The Norse world was poised on the brink. The tools were in place. Social cohesion, martial prowess, a rich mythos, and now the means to go beyond the shores of their homeland. Soon, a single act, a raid on a sacred island, would set in motion a wave of events that would thunder across Europe and beyond. But for now, in the cold twilight of the north, the Vikings were still becoming. Chapter 2, Gods of War and Wisdom, Viking Mythology. Before the first axe was raised in battle, before the longships skimmed the ocean waves and Viking names echoed in the chronicles of their enemies, there existed an invisible world that shaped every aspect of Norse life. This was the world of myth, a universe woven from the frost and fire of creation, ruled by gods who reflected the passions, flaws, and fates of humankind. To understand the Vikings, one must first understand their gods. For in the minds of the Norse, every life, every raid, every storm and victory was a thread in a cosmic tapestry governed by divine powers. At the center of their belief system stood Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, poetry, and the dead. A mysterious and complex figure, Odin was not simply a war deity who demanded blood, he was a seeker of knowledge, a wanderer cloaked in shadow who sacrificed much in his pursuit of understanding. According to legend, Odin hung himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear for 9 days and nights to gain the secrets of the runes, mystical symbols that held magical and linguistic power. He traded one of his eyes for a drink from the well of Mimir, gaining insight into the hidden workings of the cosmos. For the Norse, Odin represented the duality of life, wisdom and war, sacrifice and authority, fury and foresight. But it was not Odin alone who ruled the heavens. Thor, his mighty son, was the god of thunder, protector of gods and humans alike. Armed with Mjolnir, his enchanted hammer, Thor was a tireless defender against the chaotic forces of the giants. His booming footsteps were the thunder, his hammer strike the lightning. Farmers and warriors alike revered him, invoking his protection during storms or battles. Unlike the cunning and distant Odin, Thor was direct and unyielding, a symbol of brute strength, honor, and unwavering resolve. Then there was Loki, the trickster. Neither wholly good nor purely evil, Loki represented the unpredictable forces of fate and deceit. He was a shapeshifter, a bringer of chaos, and the architect of both divine catastrophes and salvations. Though his mischief often endangered the gods, he was also instrumental in their victories. Eventually, his betrayal would spark the doom of the gods at Ragnarok, the end times foretold in the sagas, where fire and ice would consume the world. The pantheon also included Freya, the radiant goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, commanded powerful magic called Seer, and claimed half the warriors who fell in battle, not to Odin's Valhalla, but to her own heavenly field, Folkvangr. Freya was venerated as a divine embodiment of passion and strength, a reminder that femininity in Norse culture was not weakness but fierce independence and mystic power. These deities lived in realms that were part of a grand cosmology, 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. Asgard, the realm of the gods, was linked to Midgard, the world of men, by the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge of fire and color. Jotunheim was home to the frost giants, enemies of the gods. Hel, ruled by the half-dead goddess Hel, was the cold, shadowy underworld for those who died not in glory but in sickness or age. This cosmology was not merely symbolic. It shaped the very worldview of the Vikings. Fate, or Wyrd, was immutable, even for the gods. The Norns, mysterious weavers of destiny, spun the fates of all beings. Even Odin, despite all his wisdom, could not avoid the end foretold at Ragnarok. But this inevitability did not breed despair, instead, it bred defiance. The highest virtue in Norse culture was courage in the face of doom. It was better to live honorably and die gloriously than to live long in cowardice. This belief gave the Viking warrior his fearlessness. Death in battle was not a tragedy, it was a doorway. Those who died with weapon in hand could be chosen by Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens, to ascend to Valhalla. There, in the golden halls of the slain, the brave would feast, drink, and fight until the end of days. For the Norsemen, the afterlife was not a passive reward, it was an eternal preparation for the final war. Rituals and sacrifices, both symbolic and literal, were essential in honoring the gods. Sacred groves, stone altars, and wooden temples, known as hofs, served as sites of worship. Animals were offered in seasonal festivals such as Yule and Blot. In some rare and solemn cases, human sacrifices were made to appease the gods or seek their favor before war. These acts, while alien to modern sensibilities, were expressions of deep spiritual commitment, designed to ensure the community remained in harmony with the divine order. Their myths were not written down until much later, long after Christian scribes had begun to transcribe the oral traditions into what we now call the poetic and prose Eddas. But in the Viking Age, these stories were alive, sung by skalds, the warrior poets of Norse society. Skalds were not mere entertainers. They were historians, mythmakers, and keepers of memory. Their verses preserved heroic deeds and immortalized both kings and gods. Thus, Viking mythology was not a distant theology. It was lived daily, in the naming of children, the carving of runestones, the council before battle, and the rituals of birth and burial. The Norse gods were more than distant celestial figures, they were reflections of human ambition, fear, and defiance. They reminded the Vikings that life was a fleeting spark in a dark world ruled by fate, and that the only worthy response was to burn brightly, fight boldly, and die with a weapon in hand. Chapter 3, Rise of the Longship. If the gods gave the Vikings their fearlessness, it was the longship that gave them their wings. No single invention better symbolizes the Viking Age than the longship, an elegant, deadly fusion of wood, iron, and ingenuity. Sleek in form, shallow in draught, and swift as the wind, the longship transformed the Norse from a people of fjords into masters of the sea, enabling them to reach distant shores, strike without warning, and disappear before any resistance could mount. The origins of the longship can be traced to centuries of seafaring heritage. Even before the Viking Age began, Scandinavians had been constructing boats from planks of timber, caulked and fastened with iron rivets, for fishing and trade. But it was during the early 8th century that shipbuilding underwent a revolution. Inspired by generations of coastal living and driven by a desire for speed, flexibility, and reach, Norse craftsmen created a vessel like no other in the world. The longship's design was deceptively simple. Its hull was long and narrow, designed to glide effortlessly over both deep ocean and shallow rivers. It had no fixed keel, allowing it to sail close to shore and even be carried over land if necessary. This was crucial, for the Viking warrior needed not only to travel across the sea, but to strike deep into enemy territory via inland waterways. With a depth of barely a meter, some longships could be launched onto a beach, looted, and then rowed away within the hour. Their symmetry was another marvel. The bow and stern were identical, meaning the ship could reverse direction without turning around. In battle or retreat, this gave Norse crews an astonishing tactical edge. Most were equipped with a single square sail made of wool, dyed red, yellow, or black, and supported by a sturdy mast amidships. When the wind died or the situation demanded speed, up to 40 or more oarsmen could take over, powering the ship with synchronized strokes, chanting as they rowed. Longships came in different classes. The corvette was a smaller, more versatile vessel used for transport and quick raids. The Snekja and Skade were larger warships, boasting dozens of oars and sometimes carrying up to 100 men. These ships were not only functional but works of art. Their hulls were constructed with overlapping planks, a technique known as clinker building, that gave them flexibility and strength against rough waters. The wood, usually oak, was steamed and shaped to curve naturally with the hull, creating a ship that was both resilient and fast. But it was the decoration that turned these ships into legends. The prow often bore the carved figure of a dragon, serpent, or raven, symbols meant to invoke fear in enemies and protection from the gods. These designs were not mere ornamentation, they were spiritual. A dragon-headed ship approaching from the mist was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. Villagers who glimpsed such a silhouette on the horizon often fled without a fight. The Vikings understood the power of terror. The longship was more than just a vehicle of war. It was an extension of the Viking identity. Each ship was a floating hall, a place where warriors slept, ate, and formed bonds. On longer journeys, awnings were erected for shelter, and goods were stored beneath deck boards. Crews navigated by the stars, the sun's shadow, and a deep knowledge of winds, tides, and coastal landmarks. Some historians speculate the Vikings may have used sunstones, crystals capable of detecting the sun's position on cloudy days, as primitive navigation tools. But most critically, the longship made the Norse unpredictable. No coastline was safe. From the Irish Sea to the rivers of France, from the shores of North Africa to the icy waters of Greenland, the longship carried Norsemen farther and faster than any European power could anticipate or match. Their ability to strike suddenly and disappear just as quickly left kings and monks alike paralyzed with fear. Where the Roman galleys had once ruled the Mediterranean, and where Saxon warbands had fought for inland power, the Vikings introduced a new model of mobility and shock warfare. European defenses, built to repel land-based threats, were helpless against amphibious lightning raids. Monasteries, often rich in gold and poorly defended, became favorite targets. Port towns and riverine cities stood vulnerable. Even mighty cities like Paris and Constantinople would, in time, hear the rumble of Norse drums. Yet the longship also carried settlers. It brought families to new frontiers, carrying livestock, tools, and dreams across hostile waters. It was a vessel of empire, not just plunder. With it, the Norse colonized Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. They founded cities like Dublin, traded with Byzantium, and navigated the great rivers of Russia. The longship was the lifeblood of their expansion, not only carrying warriors to war but also ideas, goods, and genes across continents. In time, the longship would evolve, growing larger, more ornate, and more specialized. But in its prime, it stood as a marvel of engineering and a symbol of terror and pride. Wherever the longship sailed, the world changed. It was the Viking sword and sanctuary, his pathway to glory and gateway to the unknown. With it, the Norse carved not just wood but history itself. Chapter 4, The Lindisfarne Raid. It began with silence, an eerie calm broken only by the soft splash of oars cutting through cold northern waters. Then, through the morning mist, they emerged, dark silhouettes on the horizon, growing larger, sharper, faster. The longships had come. For the monks of Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the northeastern coast of Northumbria, it was just another day of prayer and contemplation. But on that fateful morning of June 8, 793 AD, the world changed forever. The Vikings had arrived, and with them, the true beginning of the Viking Age. Lindisfarne was no ordinary place. Known as Holy Island, it had been a sacred Christian site for over a century. Founded in 634 AD by the Irish monk Saint Aidan, it had grown into one of the most important religious centers in Britain. Its remote location made it a place of quiet sanctity, where monks copied illuminated manuscripts, prayed in solitude, and tended to the sick and poor. The Lindisfarne Gospels, an ornate manuscript still admired today, was born here. It was a jewel of early medieval Christianity, a beacon of learning in a time of darkness. But holiness was no shield. The Vikings came without warning, launching their longships directly onto the beaches. They moved with terrifying precision, screaming war cries in a tongue the monks did not understand, clad in furs and iron, bearing axes and swords. The raiders stormed the monastery, cutting down those who stood in their way. Monks were slain at the altar. Others were dragged away into slavery. Holy relics were smashed, gold and silver looted, and sacred manuscripts torn apart or cast into the sea. It was not just the violence that stunned the Christian world, but the target. This was not a fortified city or a military outpost. It was a place of peace, devoted to God. The very idea that someone would violate such a space was, to the contemporaries, unthinkable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the raid with horror, describing heathen men who miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. Alcuin of York, a scholar at the court of Charlemagne, wrote in disbelief, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." Indeed, the psychological impact of the raid was immense. It was as if the heavens had been torn open and a new era unleashed. No longer could Christians in Europe assume that their monasteries, their churches, or their relics were safe. A new threat had emerged, one swift, merciless, and utterly foreign. Lindisfarne became a symbol, a turning point in the European imagination. For the first time, the people of the British Isles truly feared the sea, not as a barrier, but as a highway for death. Yet to the Vikings, Lindisfarne was not sacrilege, it was opportunity. The monastery was wealthy, undefended, and isolated, the perfect target for a people whose raiding traditions had long been honed on smaller, local scales back home. Raiding was not only about riches. It was about prestige, survival, and proving oneself in a culture that prized boldness and fame. The spoils taken from Lindisfarne would not only fill the coffers of Norse chieftains but elevate their status and attract loyal warriors. It was the age-old Norse practice of strandhugg, shore hunting, now turned outward onto the Christian world. Moreover, this was not the first Norse raid, only the most dramatic. Coastal areas of Ireland and the Frankish kingdoms had seen sporadic attacks in the years prior. But Lindisfarne was different. It struck at the heart of Christian identity in England and was widely recorded by scribes and scholars, ensuring its lasting legacy. It was a declaration, whether intentional or not, that nowhere was safe, not even the most sacred halls of God. The raid also reveals something deeper about the early Viking mindset. They did not yet see themselves as part of a Christian world order. Their gods were different. Their rules were different. To them, plundering Lindisfarne was no more shocking than seizing a rival chieftain's hall. The monks' treasures were simply spoils of war, and their gods no more real than the frost giants of old. Only later, as Norse societies converted to Christianity and assimilated into European structures, would this view shift. In the aftermath of Lindisfarne, fear spread like wildfire. Monasteries along the coasts of England, Scotland, and Ireland began building fortifications. Kings scrambled to organize defenses, though few had navies capable of repelling such swift attacks. Over the next decades, the Viking raids would intensify in scale and scope, evolving into full-blown invasions and settlements. But Lindisfarne would forever mark the threshold. It was the moment when the Northmen became Vikings, not just in action, but in the collective consciousness of Europe. No longer were they distant, mysterious peoples. They were now the storm from the sea, the scourge of monasteries, the shadow in the mist. For the Vikings, it was only the beginning. For Europe, it was a rude awakening. The old world was dying, and a new one, fierce, mobile, and unrelenting, had just come ashore. Chapter 5, Scandinavia Unleashed. In the decades that followed the brutal sacking of Lindisfarne, the world watched as the floodgates of the north burst open. What had once been isolated, scattered raids by small warbands now swelled into coordinated invasions. The Viking Age had entered its most aggressive and dynamic phase. A period of expansion, conquest, migration, and cultural entanglement that would leave no corner of northern Europe untouched. From the wind-lashed shores of Ireland to the icy rivers of Eastern Europe, the Norse poured forth, driven by a combustible mix of opportunity, ambition, and necessity. Scandinavia, once a collection of rugged homelands tucked between fjords and forests, was now a forge of empires and emigration. The Norse were no longer content to survive. They had begun to dominate. To understand the motivations behind this surge of Viking activity, one must look inward, into the changing dynamics of Scandinavian society itself. In the early 9th century, the region was undergoing seismic shifts. Populations were growing, placing immense pressure on arable land and resources. Internal rivalries among chieftains and noble families turned violent, and young warriors, bound by tradition to seek fame and fortune, found limited prospects at home. The social fabric was one of fierce independence and honor, and to gain respect in such a world, a man had to prove himself, not through words, but through deeds. Raiding and exploration offered an irresistible path. They promised gold, reputation, land, and glory. But it was not just internal pressures that drove the Norse outward. Across the sea, Europe lay fragmented and vulnerable. The once mighty Carolingian Empire was fracturing under the pressures of succession crises and civil wars. England was divided among rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each jealously guarding its borders. Ireland was a mosaic of warring clans, rich in monasteries but poor in unity. The river systems of Eastern Europe, vital arteries of trade, were ripe for control. The Norse understood this better than their enemies, and they were prepared to act. Each region of Scandinavia developed its own pattern of expansion, tailored to its geography and ambitions. From the rugged fjords of western Norway came the Norwegians, storm-hardened seafarers who sailed westward across the North Atlantic. They would leave their mark on the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and eventually the untouched frontiers of Iceland and Greenland. Their voyages were long, treacherous, and legendary. They established permanent settlements, integrated with local populations, and erected new Norse kingdoms on foreign shores. To the south, the Danes pursued domination across the North Sea. Denmark's proximity to the rich lands of England, Frisia, and northern France made it a launching pad for constant campaigns. Danish warlords, sometimes operating independently, sometimes allied under more centralized rule, pushed deep into English territories and established the Danelaw, a vast region where Norse language, law, and culture intermingled with the Anglo-Saxon world. The Danes proved particularly adept at transitioning from raiders to rulers, turning conquered lands into thriving domains. Further east, the Swedes carved out a different destiny. Rather than focusing on Western conquest, they looked to the great rivers that snaked through the dense forests and steppe lands of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. There, they became known as the Rus, and through a combination of trade, warfare, and diplomacy, they established powerful settlements and trading posts along the Dnieper and Volga. Their influence would culminate in the formation of the Kievan Rus, a proto-state that would eventually become the cultural and political ancestor of Russia. The Swedish Vikings, unlike their Western cousins, emphasized commerce as much as conquest, opening new routes that linked Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. It is important to recognize that the term Viking does not describe an ethnicity, but a profession and a phase of life. To go a Viking was to embark on a raid or expedition, often during the warmer seasons, after the planting was done. It was not uncommon for men to return from raids in autumn, resume farming or trading during winter, and prepare again in spring. Some expeditions were brief and opportunistic, others lasted for years, evolving into migrations and colonization efforts. The Norse were adaptive and practical. They did not raid for the sake of chaos, but because it made sense, in economic, social, and political terms. What made the Viking expansion so effective was their fluid structure. Unlike centralized states, Viking bands could mobilize quickly, reorganize in response to resistance, and strike targets with surgical precision. Their longships allowed them to penetrate deep inland, bypassing traditional defenses. They learned quickly from their encounters how to besiege towns, negotiate ransoms, or exploit rivalries among local rulers. In many cases, they were not resisted with force, but with bribes. Whole towns and kingdoms paid the Norse Danegeld, tribute, to be spared the sword. To the Vikings, it mattered little whether wealth came from loot or diplomacy. But Scandinavia's outward explosion was not only a story of violence. Alongside the sword came trade, storytelling, and cultural fusion. Norse craftsmen exchanged goods with Muslim merchants in Baghdad. Viking women married into local aristocracies in Ireland. Norse runes appeared beside Latin inscriptions on stone crosses in England. A new, hybrid world was forming. One in which Viking identity was no longer confined to Scandinavia, but was evolving across continents. Meanwhile, back in the homelands, change was underway. The wealth and connections brought back from expeditions transformed the local economy and social hierarchy. Powerful chieftains grew stronger, building alliances and paving the way for the eventual emergence of kingship and statehood in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Viking Age was not merely a time of conquest. It was the crucible in which the modern Nordic nations were forged. The world would never again think of the North as a forgotten, frozen hinterland. The Norse had stepped onto the global stage, and they had done so not as spectators, but as disruptors, creators, and kings. Chapter 6: Danelaw and the Conquest of England. Of all the lands touched by the long reach of the Norse, none would be more profoundly transformed than England. For generations, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had stood as the dominant power in the British Isles, ruled by kings and earls who traced their lineages to ancient Germanic tribes. But when the Vikings came, not only to raid but to settle, they altered the very fabric of English society. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the rise of the Danelaw, a vast region carved from the heart of England, where Norse law, language, and culture took root and flourished. It began, like much of the Viking story, with violence. In the year 865 AD, a formidable force arrived on English shores, not a raiding party, but an army. This was the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Norse warriors, reportedly composed of Danes and Norwegians, though their true numbers remain debated by historians. Unlike earlier raids that struck and fled, this army came with the intent to conquer and rule. It was led by legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, sons of the semi-mythical Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, who, according to Saga lore, had once been executed in a pit of serpents by an Anglo-Saxon king. Now, his sons sought revenge. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once mighty, were fragmented. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex all stood independently, often at odds with one another. The Vikings exploited this disunity with ruthless precision. Northumbria was the first to fall. Its capital, York, was captured in 866 and turned into a Viking stronghold. The fall of York sent shockwaves through Britain. Next came East Anglia, which fell after its king, Edmund, was defeated and, according to tradition, martyred for refusing to renounce his faith. By the early 870s, only Wessex remained as the last major kingdom resisting the Viking tide. It was here that the English found a leader equal to the challenge, Alfred, the King of Wessex. Known to history as Alfred the Great, he was a tactician, scholar, and unifier. He understood that the Viking threat could not be met by brute force alone. He reorganized his kingdom's defenses, building a network of fortified towns known as Buzz, and established a standing army that could be mobilized quickly. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred achieved a decisive victory against the Viking king Guthrum. This battle marked a turning point. Rather than annihilating the defeated Norsemen, Alfred negotiated a peace. The Treaty of Wedmore allowed Guthrum and his followers to settle in the east of England under their own law, provided they converted to Christianity. Thus, the Danelaw was born. The Danelaw was more than just a treaty line, it was a cultural frontier. It encompassed a broad swath of land stretching from the Thames to the Tees, and from the eastern coasts deep into the Midlands. Within this region, the Norse ruled, and their influence permeated every aspect of daily life. Old English gave way in many places to Old Norse, giving rise to hundreds of place names still seen today, ending in by, meaning farmstead or village, thorp, settlement, and toft, homestead. Words like sky, egg, knife, window, and husband entered the English language as part of this Norse infusion. The laws of the Danelaw were likewise distinct. Viking legal customs, which emphasized collective responsibility, compensation, and the authority of local assemblies, called things, took hold. In many places, Anglo-Saxon and Norse systems fused, resulting in a uniquely hybrid legal culture. Norse settlers established self-governing communities, intermarried with locals, and integrated into the fabric of English life. Economically, the Danelaw thrived. Viking towns such as York or Jorvik in Norse became booming centers of trade and craftsmanship. Archaeological excavations of Jorvik have revealed workshops, marketplaces, and intricate goods from across the Viking world, amber from the Baltic, silks from the East, and silver coins from the Islamic Caliphate. It was a cosmopolitan hub, a crossroads of the Viking world's reach, and one of the most important cities in northern Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. Despite this integration, conflict remained. Periodic warfare flared between Wessex and the Norse-controlled territories, and the dream of uniting England under a single crown remained elusive. But the momentum slowly shifted. Alfred's descendants, especially his grandson King Athelstan, began to consolidate power and push the Norse back. In 937, at the Battle of Brunanburh, Athelstan crushed a coalition of Norse, Scots, and Irish kings, affirming Anglo-Saxon dominance and paving the way for the unification of England. Yet even as Wessex rose, the Norse left an indelible mark. The Danelaw was not erased, it was absorbed. Its legal customs, its vocabulary, its people all became part of the new English identity. The very idea of England, a single kingdom with one language and one ruler, owes much to the conflict and fusion brought about by the Viking invasions. And the Norse would return yet again. In the early 11th century, a new wave of Danish kings, including Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Knut the Great, would conquer and rule England outright. But by then, the lines between Viking and English were already blurred. The conquerors now sat on Christian thrones, ruled through written charters, and governed not as outsiders, but as kings of a land their ancestors had once raided. The story of the Danelaw is one of paradox. Of conquest that led to assimilation, of division that led to unification, and of destruction that seeded renewal. It is one of the most profound examples of cultural transformation in medieval history, a moment when the sword gave way to settlement, and the Viking became part of England's soul. Chapter 7: The Viking Presence in Ireland and Scotland. While the Vikings carved dominions in England and ventured east toward the rivers of Russia, they also turned their eyes to the rugged coasts of Ireland and Scotland, lands rich in resources, scattered in political structure, and dotted with undefended monasteries that glimmered like ripe fruit to the sea-roving Norse. What began as a series of isolated coastal raids in the late 8th and early 9th centuries soon blossomed into permanent settlements, cultural intermingling, and the creation of new Norse Gaelic identities that would leave a permanent legacy on the Celtic world. Ireland, in particular, was a land of many kings. Unlike the centralized authority that was beginning to form in Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland in the 9th century was politically fractured into dozens of rival kingdoms and clans, each vying for supremacy in a system of shifting alliances and fierce regional pride. It was this political disunity that made the island especially vulnerable to Viking exploitation. The first major Viking raids on Irish shores began around 795 AD, with attacks on Lambay Island near Dublin and the monastery at Iona, one of the most sacred Christian sites in the Celtic world. These early raids were brutal, aimed at plunder and terror. Monasteries were sacked, relics stolen or destroyed, and monks either slaughtered or sold into slavery. But the Norse quickly recognized that Ireland offered more than fleeting treasure. Its strategic harbors, fertile lands, and decentralized politics made it an ideal location not just for raiding, but for ruling. By the 840s, the Norse had begun establishing permanent longforts, fortified ship enclosures that served as both military bases and trading settlements. The most famous of these was founded on the banks of the River Liffey in 841, Dublin, the Dark Pool, which would grow into the city of Dublin. Originally a base for raids inland, it soon became a thriving Norse Gaelic urban centre. Other longforts arose at Limerick, Waterford, Cork, and Wexford, many of which evolved into today's Irish cities. These settlements were not merely military outposts. They became centers of trade, where Norse and Irish exchanged goods, ideas, and culture. Archaeological finds in Dublin have uncovered evidence of a bustling town life: coins, combs, jewelry, tools, and imported silks, all revealing a vibrant, cosmopolitan community. Norse craftsmen worked alongside Irish artisans. Marriages between Norse warriors and Irish women were common. Over time, the boundaries between conqueror and native blurred, giving rise to a unique hybrid identity, the Norse Gaels. These Norse Gaels spoke a mixture of Old Norse and Irish, practiced Christianity with Norse customs, and governed through systems that fused Celtic clan structures with Norse laws. They became power brokers in Irish politics, forming alliances with local kings and sometimes warring against them. The Kingdom of Dublin, under Norse control, would become one of the most powerful political entities in Ireland for centuries, producing rulers like Sitrick Silkbeard, a Christian king with a Norse name, who minted coins, sponsored monasteries, and traveled to Rome as a pilgrim. Scotland, too, felt the Norse impact, though in different ways. The western and northern coasts, along with the outlying islands, the Hebrides, Orkneys, Shetlands, and parts of Caithness, became focal points for Norse colonization. These lands were sparsely populated, loosely governed, and ideal for seafaring peoples. Norse settlers arrived not merely as raiders but as pioneers, bringing their families and establishing farming communities. The Northern Isles, especially Orkney and Shetland, effectively became Norse territories, governed by jarls who owed allegiance to the kings of Norway. For generations, these islands remained outside the control of the Scottish crown. The Norse language, culture, and legal systems dominated. Even today, Norse place names abound in these regions, and the genetic and cultural legacy of these settlers persists in the people who inhabit them. The Isle of Man, positioned strategically in the Irish Sea, also came under Norse rule. It developed into a crucial hub of maritime power and trade, forming part of the broader North Sea Empire that connected Ireland, Scotland, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man into a single cultural and economic network. The Kingdom of the Isles, as it came to be called, blurred the lines between Norse and Celtic, creating a resilient Norse Gaelic culture that lasted for centuries. The relationship between the Norse and native Celtic peoples was complex. Marked by violence, yes, but also by integration and innovation. While monasteries were looted and battles waged, cultural exchange also flourished. Norse warriors adopted Irish weapons and tactics, while Irish lords began to employ Viking mercenaries known as Gall Gedhil, foreign Gaels, who fought not for pillage, but for gold and land. Despite initial devastation, the Viking presence in Ireland and Scotland led to a dynamic fusion of cultures. It altered power structures, reshaped trade routes, and birthed new communities that neither Viking nor Celt could have formed alone. When the Irish eventually rose against the Norse in battles like Clontarf in 1014, it was not a simple conflict between invader and native, it was a war between rival factions in a shared, interwoven world. The Norse had come as raiders, but in Ireland and Scotland, they became something more enduring. They became settlers, rulers, neighbors, and kin. Chapter 8: The Norsemen in the Frankish Empire. While the Vikings left an indelible mark on the British Isles, their reach did not end there. As the Norse expanded their presence, they turned their eyes to the south, toward the fractured remains of the once mighty Carolingian Empire. The lands that had once bowed to Charlemagne, now governed by weaker kings and torn by civil strife, presented a tempting prize. The rivers of Gaul, winding like veins through fertile plains and wealthy towns, became highways for Viking ships. And so, beginning in the early 9th century, the Norse descended upon the Frankish world, not merely as raiders, but as occupiers, settlers, and eventually, lords. The first major Viking raids on Frankish territory came in the early 800s. Monasteries along the River Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne were targeted. The abbey at Noirmoutier was attacked as early as 799, and by the mid-9th century, Viking longships were sailing deep into the heart of Francia, striking cities like Rouen, Nantes, Tours, and even Bordeaux. These were not coastal raids. These were deep incursions, well-organized, devastating, and unrelenting. The Norsemen had learned to exploit the rivers of Francia just as they had in England. Their shallow-draft longships allowed them to move swiftly inland, bypassing fortresses and striking unprepared towns. These campaigns often followed a familiar pattern: sudden arrival, fierce plunder, the extraction of tribute or Danegeld, and retreat, only to return again the following season. The Franks, lacking a centralized navy and struggling with internal divisions, were ill-prepared to defend their riverways. One of the most significant episodes came in 845, when a Viking fleet under the command of a chieftain named Reginhirus, often identified with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris. The city, though fortified, was poorly defended. Charles the Bald, the Carolingian king of West Francia, chose not to fight. Instead, he paid a massive ransom of 7,000 livres of silver to the Vikings to persuade them to leave. The precedent was set. The Norse could be bought off, and they knew it. For the Franks, this was a crisis. The nobility was divided, the emperor was weak, and the Viking threat was growing bolder. Paris would be besieged again in 856 and 861. In 885 to 886, a massive Viking force launched another sustained attack on the city, leading to a legendary defense by Count Odo of Paris. Though the Vikings were eventually repelled, the siege demonstrated the growing ability of the Norse to mobilize and coordinate large armies over long campaigns. But as with England and Ireland, the Viking presence in the Frankish world began to evolve from raiding to ruling. Many Norse leaders began to see the benefits of permanent settlement. The lands along the Seine were fertile, rich in towns, and ideally located for trade. Rather than returning to Scandinavia, some chieftains remained, negotiated with local lords, and integrated into the Frankish political system. The most dramatic and lasting example of this transformation came in the early 10th century, when a Viking leader named Rollo emerged as a dominant figure. A powerful warlord, Rollo had conducted numerous campaigns in northern France and posed a constant threat to the Kingdom of West Francia. In 911, King Charles the Simple, weary of war and eager for peace, struck a bold agreement. He granted Rollo and his followers a large swath of land along the lower Seine River in return for their loyalty and protection against future Viking raids. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo agreed to the terms. He converted to Christianity, was baptized, and married into Frankish nobility. His followers settled the region, established fortresses, and began the process of cultural transformation. Though Norse in origin, the Normans, descendants of Rollo's warriors, rapidly adopted the French language, customs, and feudal systems. Yet they retained their warrior ethos, their seafaring boldness, and their organizational discipline. Normandy thrived. Its fertile land supported agriculture, its position along the coast made it a center of commerce, and its leaders became some of the most powerful lords in France. Over time, the Normans would turn their attention outward, launching ambitious conquests of their own. In 1066, Rollo's descendant, William, Duke of Normandy, would cross the English Channel and claim the English crown, forever altering the course of European history. But long before that, the seeds of Norman greatness had been sown by the Vikings who carved a kingdom from the rivers of Francia. Beyond Normandy, other Viking enclaves dotted the Frankish landscape. In Aquitaine and Brittany, Norse settlers established camps, traded with locals, and married into regional aristocracies. The Carolingian emperors, unable to expel them, learned to negotiate with them. They hired Vikings as mercenaries, settled them as frontier guards, and incorporated them into the volatile fabric of feudal politics. In the end, the Viking impact on the Frankish Empire was paradoxical. They came as destroyers but stayed as builders. Their raids weakened the Carolingians, but their settlements helped shape the future of France. They introduced new trade networks, revitalized urban centers, and laid the groundwork for the rise of the Norman dukes, who would one day become kings and emperors. The Norse had conquered not just by the sword, but by adaptation. In the land of the Franks, they became lords. Chapter 9, The Eastern Expansion, Varangians and the Rus. While the Norse carved dominions in the west, storming monasteries, founding cities, and transforming kingdoms, they were simultaneously embarking on a vastly different but no less extraordinary journey to the east. This was not the world of Frankish kings or Anglo-Saxon earls, but one of deep forests, vast steppes, and mighty rivers. It was a world where Scandinavians would become traders, diplomats, warriors, and rulers. Their destination was the Slavic and Finno-Ugric lands that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and ultimately to the glittering domes of Byzantium. In this eastern theater of the Viking saga, they were known not as Vikings, but as Varangians, and eventually, as the Rus. The story of the eastern expansion begins in the 8th and 9th centuries, as Swedish seafarers, distinct from their Danish and Norwegian cousins, set out from the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea. They sailed across the Gulf of Finland, navigated the Neva River, and entered the dense and often hostile interior of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. There, they discovered a vast interconnected system of rivers, particularly the Fokhov, Dnieper, and Volga. That allowed them to travel great distances by boat, even portaging their ships overland when necessary. These waterways were not only paths into the heart of the Slavic world, they were highways of trade leading all the way to the Caspian Sea and Constantinople. At first, the Swedish Norse came as traders. They brought with them furs from Scandinavia, finely crafted weapons, iron tools, amber, and slaves captured in raids or bartered from local tribes. In return, they sought luxury goods from the east, silks, spices, glassware, and above all, silver. Arab coins, dirhams, became the lifeblood of the Viking economy, and archaeological digs across Scandinavia have unearthed thousands of them, evidence of just how important this eastern trade route became. But commerce was never separate from power. The Norse soon realized that to control trade, they had to control territory. They began establishing fortified settlements along the rivers. At Staraya Ladiga, Novgorod, and eventually Kiev. These were not random outposts. They were strategically located hubs of trade, diplomacy, and governance. The Norse, despite their outsider status, managed to integrate with the local Slavic populations through marriage, warfare, and a gradual blending of cultures. Over time, they came to be known collectively as the Rus, a term whose etymology remains debated but is widely believed to derive from an Old Norse word meaning rowers or seafarers. According to the primary chronicle, a semi-legendary historical account compiled by monks centuries later, the Slavic tribes of the region grew weary of internal conflict and invited a Norse prince named Rurik to rule over them. Rurik allegedly arrived in Novgorod around 862 AD, establishing the first dynasty of what would become the Kievan Rus. His successors expanded southward, consolidating power along the Dnieper River. One of the most remarkable of these leaders was Oleg of Novgorod, who captured Kiev in 882 and declared it the new capital. From this base, the Rus would build a powerful state. By the early 10th century, the Rus were a force to be reckoned with. They launched daring expeditions down the Dnieper to the Black Sea, challenging the might of the Byzantine Empire. In 907, Oleg reputedly nailed his shield to the gates of Constantinople, a symbolic gesture of defiance and strength. Treaties followed, and trade flourished. The Byzantines recognized the value of the Rus, not just as merchants, but as warriors. Out of this recognition was born one of the most famous Viking legacies in the East, the Varangian Guard. This elite unit of Norse warriors served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors, prized for their loyalty, fearlessness, and skill in battle. Unlike the shifting loyalties of local factions, the Varangians swore allegiance only to the emperor himself. Clad in heavy armor and wielding massive axes, they became legendary defenders of the Byzantine court. For a Norse warrior, to be chosen for the Varangian Guard was an honor as great as dying in battle. It was a mark of prestige, proof of elite status, and a path to great wealth. Meanwhile, the Rus state continued to grow. Under rulers like Igor, Olga, and Sviatoslav, it expanded its borders, strengthened trade links, and cemented diplomatic relations with both the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire. The Rus sent embassies to Constantinople, adopted aspects of Greek architecture and religion, and participated in the vast exchange of goods and ideas that defined the medieval East. Yet the most transformative moment came in the late 10th century under Prince Vladimir the Great. Though the Rus had long maintained ties with both pagans and Christians, Vladimir made the bold decision to officially convert his realm to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In 988, he was baptized, likely in Chersonesus in Crimea, and ordered the Christianization of Kiev and surrounding regions. Pagan idols were cast into rivers, and churches began to rise. The Norse gods were fading, and a new faith was taking their place, not from the sword, but from diplomacy and marriage. This conversion marked the end of the Viking Age in the East. The Rus, once fierce pagan raiders, were now Christian monarchs, building cathedrals and codifying laws. But the Norse legacy endured, in the names, in the royal bloodlines, in the cultural memory of a people who had once ruled the rivers with sword and sail. From the icy Baltic to the golden spires of Constantinople, the Eastern Vikings, the Varangians, had forged an empire not with mass conquests, but with patient colonization, keen diplomacy, and the adaptability that had always defined the Norse spirit. Chapter 10, Norse Culture and Daily Life. Beneath the blood and thunder of Viking raids, beyond the flame-lit monasteries and echoing battle cries, there existed a quieter world. A world of farms and fjords, of hearths and homesteads, of rites and rhythms shaped not only by war, but by wind, earth, and belief. Though the Norse are often remembered as warriors and conquerors, they were first and foremost people, craftsmen, farmers, sailors, parents, poets. Their daily lives, shaped by the harsh beauty of the Scandinavian landscape, were deeply rooted in custom, cooperation, and a profound respect for the cycles of nature and fate. At the heart of Norse society was the langhus, or longhouse, a communal building constructed from timber, stone, and turf, which served as both home and hall. Here, an extended family might live under one roof, alongside their servants, livestock, and stores. The longhouse was not simply a structure, it was a symbol of social identity, a place where lineage was preserved, hospitality offered, and stories told. Its central hearth burned day and night, providing heat, light, and a spiritual center for the home. Meals were cooked here, children raised beside it, and in winter, the family would gather around the fire to spin wool, mend tools, and recite sagas that linked them to gods and ancestors. Most Norse people were farmers. The short, intense growing season meant agriculture had to be efficient and community-driven. Barley, rye, and oats were staples, along with root vegetables and cabbage. Livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, provided milk, meat, hides, and wool. Fishing was vital in coastal areas, while hunting supplemented the diet with wild game. The labor was grueling and unending, but survival bred resilience, and the Norse were masters at wringing sustenance from even the most unforgiving terrain. women in Norse society held a respected and vital role. Far from being passive figures, they managed households, directed farming operations in the absence of men, and held authority over domestic matters. They could inherit land, initiate divorce, and run businesses. Grave goods found in burials often include keys, a symbol of female authority within the household. In some cases, women were buried with swords, suggesting they may have also taken part in warfare or held positions of power. The sagas, too, tell of shield maidens. Fierce women who fought alongside men, though their historical existence remains debated. Children were taught early to contribute. Boys learned farming, shipbuilding, and weapons training, while girls mastered textile production, cooking, and animal care. Education was practical and oral. There were no schools in the modern sense, but knowledge passed through generations via storytelling, apprenticeship, and ritual. Literacy was rare, but runes, carved into wood, stone, or bone, served as a rudimentary writing system for short inscriptions, memorials, and magic charms. Trade was integral to Norse life. Markets sprang up at seasonal gatherings known as things, which served as both legal assemblies and commercial fairs. Here, goods from across the Viking world were exchanged: furs, amber, soapstone, swords, silver, cloth, and slaves. The Norse were prolific traders, connecting Scandinavia to the Silk Road via rivers and seas. Coins from Abbasid Baghdad, beads from the Mediterranean, and tools from the Frankish kingdoms have all been found in Viking graves, evidence of a far-flung mercantile network that belies the stereotype of the Viking as a mere plunderer. Law and justice were governed through these same things, assemblies of free men who debated disputes, witnessed oaths, and issued rulings. There were no jails, punishment ranged from fines and exile to outlawry. A dreaded sentence that stripped a man of all legal protections. An outlaw could be hunted down like an animal, and anyone who aided him risked sharing his fate. Justice was not abstract but communal. Honor, reputation, and kinship were the pillars upon which order stood. Religion, too, permeated every aspect of Norse life. The Norse pantheon was rich and complex: Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom and war; Thor, the Thunderer, protector of mankind; Freya, goddess of love and death; Loki, the trickster, both a friend and a threat to the gods. The cosmos itself was a great tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots bound the 9 worlds together. Life was seen as a series of trials shaped by fate, or Wyrd, and the greatest virtue was to meet one's destiny with courage. Death in battle could lead to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where the fallen would feast and fight until the end of days. Rituals were both sacred and practical. Blots, sacrificial feasts, were held to honor the gods and ensure fertility, victory, or protection. Animals, and occasionally humans, were sacrificed, their blood smeared on altars and idols. Sacred groves, wells, and stones served as temples long before churches dotted the Nordic landscape. Seeresses, known as vulvas, acted as oracles, channeling divine knowledge through ecstatic trance and song. Their presence at funerals, seasonal rites, and royal courts underscores the mystical current that ran through Norse culture. Art and craftsmanship were highly developed. Viking woodcarvers etched intricate designs into ships, weapons, and everyday tools, often featuring interlacing animals and mythological scenes. Metalworkers produced ornate brooches, swords, and arm rings, some of which rival the finest Frankish and Byzantine work in their complexity. Even clothing displayed a sense of identity: woolen tunics dyed in vibrant colors, belts decorated with bronze fittings, and cloaks clasped with elaborate pins. Music and poetry were central to Norse expression. Skalds, poet-historians, composed Drakvate, a sophisticated form of verse filled with alliteration, metaphor, and coded references. Skaldic poetry preserved the deeds of kings, warriors, and gods, serving as both entertainment and historical record. These poems were not written but memorized, recited by firelight in halls echoing with the clash of cups and the roar of laughter. The Norse worldview was one of balance. Between life and death, order and chaos, fate and choice. It was a society rooted in kinship and bound by honor, where wealth was shared in rings, hospitality sacred, and the spoken oath as binding as iron. While the world remembers the Vikings for their raids and conquests, it was this rich cultural fabric, the songs, the rituals, the laws, the homes, that sustained them across generations. They were not just warriors, they were a people. And within their daily lives burned the same fire that drove them across oceans and into history. Chapter 11, Viking Mythology and the World of the Gods. To understand the Viking mind is to step into a cosmos unlike any other, vast, perilous, and awe-inspiring. This was a world woven from myth and mystery, where gods did not dwell in serene omnipotence but strode through storms and shadows, facing the same dooms and doubts as mortals. Norse mythology, passed down orally for centuries before it was finally written in the Icelandic sagas and Eddas, is a cosmological tapestry, rich in symbolism, fierce in imagination, and grounded in the realities of the harsh northern world. In this mythology, the Vikings found not just religion, but identity, purpose, and the courage to live, and die, with honor. At the center of the Norse universe stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense, sacred ash that connected all realms of existence. Its roots and branches extended across 9 distinct worlds: Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods; Midgard, the world of humanity; Jotunheim, the land of giants; Vanaheim, realm of fertility deities; Niflheim, the icy realm of the dead; Muspelheim, land of fire and chaos, and others, each populated by beings strange and powerful. These worlds were not just distant dimensions, they existed in a metaphysical balance. The Norse did not see the cosmos as linear or ordered, but as cyclical, unstable, and governed by forces both divine and monstrous. The gods themselves were anything but perfect. The Aesir, led by Odin the All-Father, ruled from Asgard but were neither immortal nor all-knowing. Odin was a complex figure, a war god, a seeker of wisdom, a poet, and a trickster in his own right. He had sacrificed one of his eyes at the well of Mimir for knowledge and hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the secrets of the runes. He valued cunning as much as strength and was often accompanied by his ravens, Hugin and Munin. Thought and memory, as he surveyed the world. Then there was Thor, Odin's son and the thunder god, beloved by warriors and farmers alike. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, Thor defended Asgard from giants and chaos. He was strength incarnate, protector of humanity, and a fierce opponent of the destructive forces that threatened the cosmos. Unlike Odin, who schemed and whispered, Thor acted boldly and directly, crushing enemies, calming storms, and drinking ale by the barrel. Other gods included Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and death, who rode a chariot drawn by cats and wept golden tears; Loki, the shape-shifting trickster whose deeds brought both wonder and catastrophe; Tyr, the god of justice, who sacrificed his hand to bind the monstrous wolf Fenrir; and Baldur, the radiant and doomed god, whose death signaled the beginning of the end. The gods were bound not only by kinship and power, but by fate, a force even they could not escape. Beneath these gods loomed the Jotnar, giants, often adversaries but sometimes lovers and kin to the gods. They represented the primordial forces of chaos, wild nature, and destruction. The boundaries between friend and foe were fluid in Norse myth. The gods were not paragons of virtue, and the giants were not always villains. This duality reflected the Viking worldview, that life was full of uncertainty, and power could be both creative and cruel. One of the most captivating aspects of Norse mythology was its end, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Unlike other mythologies that envisioned a perpetual divine order, Norse myth accepted that even gods die. Ragnarok was a prophetic vision of destruction and renewal. The sun and moon would be devoured, stars would vanish, and the world would tremble. Fenrir the wolf would break free, the Midgard serpent Jormungandr would rise from the sea, and Loki would lead an army of the dead. In the final battle, Odin would fall to Fenrir, Thor would kill Jormungandr but succumb to its venom, and fire would consume the world. But this was not the end. From the ashes, a new world would rise. The surviving gods would return, and 2 human survivors would repopulate the earth. The Norse saw in Ragnarok not just doom, but transformation. Death was part of the cosmic cycle, and courage in the face of inevitable destruction was the highest virtue. It was better to die with sword in hand than to live in dishonor. This belief shaped the Viking ethos: boldness, resilience, and the acceptance of fate as a companion, not an enemy. The mythology was not confined to sagas and temples. It infused daily life. Warriors wore Thor's hammer amulets as protection. Ships were adorned with dragon heads to ward off sea monsters. Rituals and blots honored the gods at sacred groves and altars. Runes were carved with spells and invocations. Even in burial, the myths lived on. Viking graves often contained weapons, tools, food, and sometimes ships, all meant to aid the dead in the journey to the afterlife, whether to Valhalla, where the bravest would feast with Odin, or to Helheim, the cold, shadowy realm ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki. The oral tradition ensured that these stories endured. Skalds recited them in the great halls. Children learned them by firelight. They were not static dogma, but living memory. Flexible, poetic, and filled with awe. And though Christianity would eventually eclipse the old gods, they were never truly forgotten. The Norse myths persisted in folklore, in stone, and in the Icelandic texts recorded centuries after the Viking Age ended. To the Vikings, mythology was not mere religion, it was a lens through which to see the world. It gave meaning to storms, explained the unknown, and offered a blueprint for valor in life and dignity in death. In their gods, they saw themselves, proud, fallible, fierce, and bound to a fate that even the divine could not alter. This mythology, etched in rune and recited in saga, remains one of the most profound legacies of the Viking Age, a testament to a people who looked into the chaos of the cosmos and raised their sails toward it. Chapter 12: The Art of Shipbuilding and Seafaring. When the world speaks of the Vikings, one image rises above all others. The longship, gliding across the mist-covered sea, its carved dragon prow slicing through the waves, its square sail swollen with northern wind. No other artifact so completely captures the essence of the Norse spirit, their restlessness, their daring, their ingenuity, and their intimacy with the sea. For the Vikings were not merely warriors or traders. They were mariners of unmatched skill, explorers whose mastery of shipbuilding and navigation enabled them to reach farther, raid deeper, and settle wider than any other people of their age. Viking ships were a marvel of early medieval engineering. They were constructed with both beauty and brutality in mind, designed to be fast, light, and flexible, yet strong enough to endure the fury of the North Atlantic. The key to this genius lay in the clinker building technique, in which overlapping wooden planks, usually oak, were riveted together with iron nails and sealed with wool or animal hair soaked in tar. This gave the hull elasticity and strength, allowing it to flex with the movement of the waves rather than break apart. Two main types of ships defined Norse seamanship, the nar and the langskip, or longship. The nar was a robust, deep-hulled cargo vessel designed for trade and long voyages. It could carry heavy loads, including livestock, timber, grain, and settlers. It was the nar that carried Norsemen to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The longship, by contrast, was the blade of Viking warfare, long, narrow, and shallow-drafted, capable of incredible speed and maneuverability. With symmetrical ends and a keel for stability, it could reverse direction instantly. Its shallow hull allowed it to sail not only across open seas but far up rivers, deep into the heartlands of Europe. The most famous of these ships were the Drekker, or dragon ships, so named for their elaborately carved prows, often shaped into the heads of beasts meant to frighten both enemies and evil spirits. These vessels were not only weapons of war, they were works of art, moving symbols of a chieftain's wealth, power, and divine favor. They bristled with shields along their rails, and oars, manned by warriors, dipped rhythmically into the sea like the legs of a centipede. But it wasn't just the craftsmanship of the ships, it was what they enabled. With these vessels, the Norse were no longer confined to their fjords and forests. The ocean became a road rather than a barrier. They reached the Scottish Isles, the Irish coast, the rivers of Gaul, the steppes of Rus, and even the icy coasts of Greenland and Vinland. Their mobility gave them the upper hand in warfare, trade, and colonization. A Viking fleet could strike suddenly and vanish before a kingdom could muster its defenses. They could land an army, conduct a raid, and retreat in the time it took a messenger to reach the next town. Navigation was achieved not through compasses or maps, but through deep familiarity with the sea. Viking sailors read the stars, the shape of waves, the flight patterns of seabirds, the color of water, the scent of land, and even the temperature of the wind. They used sunstones, calcite crystals that could detect the sun's position on cloudy days, and may have employed primitive instruments to determine latitude. Yet their most powerful tool was memory. Sea captains memorized routes, currents, and landmarks in a mental map passed down through generations. The social structure aboard ship mirrored that of Norse society, hierarchical yet bonded by shared risk. A ship's steeryman, or steersman, was often its commander, chosen for experience and reputation. Rowers and warriors served together, ate together, and fought together. The ship itself became a floating hall, a home, and a symbol of clan identity. Ceremonies were held aboard. Oaths were sworn on the prow. And when great warriors died, their ships often became their coffins, buried beneath mounds or set ablaze at sea, carrying them to the afterlife. One of the most remarkable feats of Norse seafaring was the crossing of the North Atlantic, a treacherous, wind-lashed expanse few dared to challenge. Yet the Vikings not only sailed it, they mastered it. From Norway to the Shetland and Faroe Islands, to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, they charted a northern corridor that would remain unmatched until the age of exploration. In the late 10th century, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland to a place he called Vinland, likely somewhere along the coasts of modern Newfoundland. This made the Norse the first known Europeans to set foot in North America, centuries before Columbus. Seafaring was not merely a means of expansion. It was a cultural identity. The sea shaped their myths, their songs, their rituals. It gave rise to the idea of fate as a wave, ever-changing, powerful, and often cruel. The sea was their crucible and their canvas. In it, they proved themselves again and again, not just as raiders, but as explorers, traders, poets, and pioneers. Even today, the Viking longship endures as a symbol, not just of conquest, but of daring, craftsmanship, and boundless curiosity. Sleek and deadly, graceful and raw, these ships were extensions of the men who built and sailed them, men who saw the edge of the world not as an end, but as an invitation. They were born of the fjords but made for the horizon. And with every oar stroke, every wind-filled sail, they wrote their legend on the water. Chapter 13, Viking Exploration of the North Atlantic. Among the most awe-inspiring chapters in Viking history is their daring expansion across the North Atlantic. A journey not born merely of conquest, but of restlessness, vision, and a will to test the very edges of the known world. From the forested shores of Scandinavia to the mist-shrouded coasts of Iceland, the icy fjords of Greenland, and finally to the mysterious and fertile lands of Vinland, the Vikings pushed beyond the limits of what any European people had attempted before them. This was a story not just of exploration, but of colonization, survival, and a fleeting Norse footprint on the shores of North America. The first leap came around 860 AD, when Norse sailors, driven off course or curious to push farther, encountered the remote volcanic island of Iceland. Rugged, uninhabited save for a few Irish monks who quickly departed, Iceland offered both promise and peril. Its volcanic soil was rich in some regions, the fishing bountiful, and the land open for settlement. Yet its winters were brutal, and its landscape alien. Geysers, lava fields, and glaciers coexisted in a haunting northern wilderness. Despite its challenges, Iceland quickly became a haven for Norse settlers. Many were seeking more than land, they sought refuge. In Norway, the rise of King Harald Fairhair in the late 9th century had led to the consolidation of power and the suppression of independent chieftains. Many of these displaced families fled westward, bringing with them their culture, sagas, livestock, and tools. Within a few generations, Iceland had transformed into a thriving Norse society. What made Iceland unique was not just its location, but its governance. Lacking a central king, Iceland developed a remarkable system of communal self-rule known as the Althing, established around 930 AD. This open-air parliament, the oldest surviving legislative assembly in the world, met annually at Ingvellir, a natural amphitheater of stone and stream. Here, laws were recited from memory, disputes resolved, and political alliances forged. The Icelandic sagas, which would later preserve the memory of Viking heroes and voyages, were born in this literate, independent, and deeply oral society. But even Iceland was not the end. As early as the 980s, explorers began to hear tales of land even farther west, cold and treacherous, yet rich in game. One such explorer, Eric the Red, a fiery and ambitious outlaw from Norway by way of Iceland, took these stories seriously. Banished from Iceland for manslaughter, Eric set out into the unknown, sailing across the Denmark Strait until he reached a massive, ice-laced land he would name Grönland, Greenland. The name was no accident. Eric, ever the shrewd promoter, believed a pleasant name would attract settlers, despite Greenland's brutal climate. Around 985, he returned to Iceland and successfully convinced several hundred people to join him. They established two major settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast, the eastern and western settlements. Despite their names, both were relatively close together, nestled in fjords where the climate was slightly milder. Life in Greenland was harsh. The growing season was short, the land was rocky, and resources were scarce. Yet the Norse survived through a mix of farming, hunting, and trade. They raised cattle and sheep, fished the icy seas, and hunted seals and caribou. Greenland even exported walrus ivory, highly prized in Europe, as well as furs and polar bear skins. For a time, the Greenland colonies thrived, maintaining ties with Iceland and Norway and even building stone churches and farms. But Greenland, too, was not the edge of the Norse imagination. Oral tales had long circulated of a strange land even farther west, lush, wooded, and rich in wild grapes. Inspired by these rumors, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, embarked on one of history's most extraordinary journeys. Around the year 1000, Leif set sail from Greenland with a small crew and made landfall in a series of new territories. The sagas recount several distinct regions explored during this voyage. The first, Helgeland, was a stony, barren land thought to be modern-day Baffin Island. The second, Markland, was forested and fertile, likely Labrador. But it was Vinland, the final and most hospitable landfall, that captivated Leif and his followers. Described as mild, with plentiful resources and wild grapes, Vinland has long been associated with coastal Newfoundland, specifically the site at Lons Meadows, where archaeologists have confirmed the existence of a Norse settlement, complete with turf buildings, ironworking, and artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian in origin. This settlement, though small and short-lived, represents the first known European presence in North America, centuries before Columbus. The Norse had crossed the Atlantic in open wooden ships, navigated treacherous waters, and built homes in a new world. They had achieved a feat of exploration unmatched in their age. Yet the Vinland settlement did not last. Why the Norse did not establish a permanent colony in North America is still debated. Hostile encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the sagas call Skrælingjar, likely played a role, as did the logistical difficulty of sustaining a colony so far from established Norse territories. Climate change, limited resources, and internal strife may have also contributed. After a few years, the Vinland outpost was abandoned, leaving behind only traces in soil and saga. Still, the impact of these journeys was profound. They revealed the extent of Norse ambition and resilience. They demonstrated an ability to colonize and adapt, to explore with precision and survive in unforgiving landscapes. The Norse North Atlantic world, spanning Norway, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, was one of the most extraordinary achievements of the early Middle Ages. In their longships, guided by stars and song, the Vikings had stitched together a maritime empire across stormy seas and unknown shores. Not through conquest alone, but through courage, ingenuity, and a relentless drive to see what lay beyond the horizon. Chapter 14: Viking Warfare and Battle Tactics. To the world they encountered, the Vikings were a storm from the sea, swift, unpredictable, and devastating. Yet behind the fury of their raids and the legends of their berserkers lay a far more complex reality. Viking warfare was not chaos. It was a deliberate, evolving system of strategy, technology, and cultural values that emphasized mobility, discipline, and psychological dominance. Though often outnumbered by the forces of kings and empires, the Norse made themselves feared and remembered through sheer tactical brilliance and a warrior ethos that permeated every fiber of their lives. The image of the Viking warrior is burned into history. A man clad in a conical helmet, round shield slung on his back, wielding a sword or axe with grim purpose. Yet despite the popular depiction, there is no evidence that Vikings wore horned helmets. These were artistic inventions of later centuries. Real Viking helmets were practical, often made of iron with a nose guard and sometimes a mail curtain to protect the neck. Armor, where available, was usually chainmail or heavy leather reinforced with metal. But such equipment was expensive, and most warriors, especially in the early raids, fought with only a shield, axe, and raw determination. The backbone of Viking battle tactics was the shield wall, a formation in which warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a solid barrier of wood and iron. This formation allowed them to absorb charges, block missile attacks, and move as a unit. It was both offensive and defensive, used to protect weaker fighters behind the line or to push forward with brutal force. Discipline and cohesion were vital. Though known for their ferocity, Viking warriors were also drilled, organized, and deeply familiar with the terrain and conditions of combat. A Viking's most important tool was not necessarily his weapon, but his shield. Typically made from linden wood and reinforced with an iron boss at the center, the round shield was light, maneuverable, and used both for defense and attack. Warriors trained to punch, hook, and push with their shields, disrupting enemy lines and creating openings. Behind the wall, spearmen could thrust forward, and axemen could swing over the top. Axes were the most common weapon, accessible, versatile, and devastating. From the simple one-handed bearded axe to the terrifying Dane axe, a two-handed weapon with a crescent-shaped blade, the axe was both a tool and a symbol. Swords were rarer, expensive to make and often inherited, carried as marks of honor. These were double-edged, well-balanced weapons ideal for cutting and thrusting, often richly decorated and given names like Legbiter or Blood Serpent. Spears, too, were ubiquitous. Used for throwing and thrusting, with long, narrow points that could pierce armor or catch in shields. Bows were also an important part of Viking arsenals, particularly in ambushes or during sieges. Norse archers used powerful longbows crafted from yew or elm, capable of launching arrows with deadly force. In larger engagements, volleys of arrows would soften enemy lines before the charge. Slings, javelins, and throwing axes, like the Francisca, added to the Viking arsenal, allowing for flexibility across different types of terrain. Perhaps the most feared warriors in Viking ranks were the berserkers, men said to fight in a trance-like fury, immune to pain and fear. Their name likely derives from bjarsurkr, meaning bear shirt, suggesting either a literal bearskin worn in battle or a symbolic channeling of animal rage. Though their existence is debated, medieval sources describe berserkers as shock troops, used to terrify enemies and break lines. Whether drug-induced, ritualistic, or exaggerated in legend, the idea of the berserker captured the psychological edge the Vikings wielded over their foes. Raids were planned with ruthless efficiency. Viking leaders chose targets with care: isolated monasteries, poorly defended coastal towns, and trade routes vulnerable to interruption. They struck at dawn or under the cover of mist, appearing as if from nowhere, their longships gliding silently into harbors and estuaries. The speed of their assaults left little time for resistance. Victims were overwhelmed, and by the time local lords could muster a response, the raiders had vanished with captives, silver, livestock, and goods. But the Vikings were not just raiders, they were conquerors. In Ireland, England, and Francia, they transitioned from plundering to occupation. This required different tactics. They built fortresses called longforts. Military encampments at river mouths and estuaries that served as bases for further campaigns. They formed alliances, exploited local rivalries, and even served as mercenaries. Their adaptability in warfare, shifting between guerrilla raids and pitched battles, allowed them to outmaneuver enemies with superior numbers. Naval warfare was another strength. Viking longships were not just transport, they were weapons. In sea battles, ships would form lines, lash together, and create floating platforms from which warriors fought. Grappling hooks and boarding tactics turned sea battles into chaotic melees. Their naval mastery allowed them to project power deep inland via rivers, a strategic advantage no European force could match at the time. Siege warfare also evolved in the later Viking Age. Though not initially equipped for prolonged sieges, the Norse learned quickly. In England, they constructed wooden fortifications to trap enemy forces. In Francia, they besieged cities like Paris and extracted massive ransoms. In Ireland, they fortified Dublin and other coastal settlements. Their ability to shift from raiders to rulers depended on their growing expertise in occupying and defending territory. Beyond the battlefield, Viking warfare was deeply tied to culture and belief. A warrior's death in battle was not an end, it was a passage. Those who died bravely were believed to be taken by Valkyries to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Cowardice or dishonor, by contrast, condemned the soul to Helheim, a cold and joyless afterlife. This belief gave Viking warriors a psychological edge, facing death without fear, driven by the certainty that valor transcended mortality. Even their enemies recognized this. Chroniclers in England and Francia described Viking warriors as demons and beasts, not only because of their violence but because of their fearlessness. They did not fight as soldiers seeking pay or land, but as warriors proving themselves before gods and kin. In time, as the Norse settled and intermarried, their methods of warfare would change. They would adopt feudal tactics, learn castle building, and fight in the armies of kings they once raided. Yet the memory of their early campaigns, bold, swift, and unrelenting, would echo through the centuries. The Vikings did not invent war. But they reshaped it, into something leaner, faster, and more personal. Whether storming a fortress or standing in a shield wall, they fought not only to win, but to be remembered. And through their skill, their bravery, and their myth, they ensured that they would be. Chapter 15, Viking Legacy and Transformation. As the winds of time carried the last dragon-prowed ships into memory and the war cries faded from the coasts of Europe, the Viking Age slowly came to an end, but its spirit never truly died. Though the era of sudden raids and pagan warriors yielded to Christian kings and centralized kingdoms, the legacy of the Norse endured, etched into the land, the languages, the bloodlines, and the very foundations of the medieval world. The transformation of the Vikings from seaborne raiders into settlers, rulers, and cultural contributors is one of the most fascinating arcs in European history. Their legacy, far from being one of mere destruction, is a story of adaptation, integration, and enduring influence. By the mid-11th century, the Viking world was changing. Christianity, once a foreign religion to be mocked or feared, had spread through Scandinavia, gradually replacing the old gods with the cross. This conversion was not sudden but came in waves, through trade, diplomacy, marriage, and eventually the sword. Kings like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, and Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, played central roles in Christianizing their realms. Missionaries were followed by bishops, churches, and laws that outlawed pagan sacrifice and blot rituals. The conversion reshaped Norse society, aligning it more closely with the rest of Christian Europe and marking a cultural turning point. But this was not the death of the Norse, it was their metamorphosis. Viking leaders began to build kingdoms, not plunder them. They wrote laws, minted coins, established towns, and sponsored art and architecture. Norsemen who once raided monasteries now funded churches. Former raiders became Christian knights. The values of bravery and honor were not discarded, but reframed within the moral codes of the new faith. Saga literature, written down in the newly Christianized Iceland, preserved both the pagan past and Christian present in a uniquely rich tradition that still survives today. Politically, the impact of the Vikings was enormous. In England, they had seized half the country during the 9th century in what became known as the Danelaw. A region where Norse customs, laws, and language intermingled with Anglo-Saxon culture. The final blow to Anglo-Saxon independence came in 1066 when William the Conqueror, himself descended from Norse settlers in Normandy, invaded and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Though the Normans were French-speaking and Christian, their roots lay in Viking blood, and their conquest of England would forever bear that imprint. In Normandy, the Norse had transformed from feared invaders into feudal lords. Granted land by the Frankish king in 911 under Rollo, a Norse chieftain who became the first Duke of Normandy, the Vikings assimilated quickly. They adopted the French language, converted to Christianity, and embraced continental customs. Yet they remained formidable warriors, and their dynasty would go on to found kingdoms not only in England but also in Sicily and the Crusader states of the Levant. In Eastern Europe, the Varangians, the Swedish Norse who founded the Rus, had evolved into a distinct Slavic Christian power. The Kievan Rus, once a collection of Viking trading posts and fortresses, became a powerful medieval state that served as a cultural and political bridge between the Byzantine and Slavic worlds. Though they lost their Norse identity over time, their foundation was undeniably Viking. The name Russia itself is a linguistic echo of the Rus, a reminder of their origin on the rivers and steppe. Even in the North Atlantic, the Norse legacy lingered. Iceland remained a bastion of Norse culture and language, preserving stories, law codes, and traditions that were lost elsewhere. The sagas written there between the 12th and 14th centuries represent one of the great literary achievements of medieval Europe, epic narratives that blend history, myth, and moral reflection. They give voice to the ambitions, flaws, and memories of a people who once called the sea their road. Greenland's Norse colonies eventually faded, succumbing to climate change, isolation, and economic hardship. Yet their ruins remain, stone churches, farmsteads, and graveyards hidden beneath lichen and snow, whispering of a time when even the edge of the world bore Viking footprints. And though their Vinland outpost in North America was short-lived, it proved the Vikings' capacity to dream beyond the visible horizon, a feat not repeated by Europeans for another 500 years. Culturally, the Vikings left an indelible mark. Norse mythology influenced European literature, art, and philosophy, especially during the Romantic and Victorian eras. In modern times, the image of the Viking has been mythologized, reshaped, and sometimes distorted, but always remembered. From operas and novels to films, television, and video games, the Viking Age continues to captivate the imagination. The Norse also left behind tangible genetic and linguistic legacies. In parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, place names still bear Norse roots, towns ending in by, farmstead, thorp, village, or Ness, headland. In the Faroes and Iceland, the Norse tongue evolved into new dialects that remain closest to Old Norse today. In the genetic makeup of the British Isles and Normandy, Viking ancestry endures. Their descendants live not in remote fjords alone, but across the lands their ancestors once shaped with sword and sail. But perhaps their greatest legacy is psychological. The Vikings dared. They defied geography and fear. They sailed into the unknown not out of recklessness, but conviction, that the world was vast and full of opportunity, and that the bold might not only survive but thrive. They were a people who embraced risk, who honored loyalty, who cherished story and memory. They built communities across half the known world and left behind not just destruction, but connection. They changed history, not only through conquest, but through transformation. And in that transformation lies the true power of their legacy, the ability to evolve without erasing the past, to leave behind not only relics and ruins, but inspiration. The Viking Age may have ended, but the Viking spirit sails on. Echoes of the North, long after the last sail vanished beyond the horizon, the legacy of the Vikings endured, not in ash and ruin, but in memory, in culture, in blood. Their names still echo in the sagas, their gods live on in stories, their spirit stirs in the adventurous, the fearless, the bold. From raiders to rulers, from pagans to kings, the Norse adapted to a changing world without forgetting who they were. They left behind more than battles, they left behind ideas. A belief in fate, in honor, in daring beyond the known. And through their voyages and vision, they stitched together a world that defied borders, linking Scandinavia to the heart of Europe, to the icy edge of Greenland, and even to the unknown lands of North America. They were a people of contradiction, brutal and poetic, destructive and creative, feared and admired. But above all, they were remembered. And in that memory, the Viking Age never truly ends. It lives on, in words, in legends, in us.